Javier Espinoza, Financial Times, Lewis Crofts, MLex, Samuel Stolton, Bloomberg. Very warm welcome to the Digital Markets Research Hub, a small corner on YouTube where we try to understand the latest development in regulating competition in digital markets. And as we can see, we live in a kind of surreal time where competition policy not only becomes kind of mainstream or at least agenda setting or headliner, we also come to the situation where the prominent reporters are being interviewed by an academic within this series. I really appreciate this opportunity, and I know how busy you are, so I wanted to go straight to the issue. What, in your view, is the reason why digital competition becomes so popular these days? Is it because just everybody thinks that they are an expert in Facebook and Google stuff more than in chemicals, or there must be something else? Lewis, let's start with you.
I think that's it. I mean, you go back to competition law 20, 30 years ago, and it was about complex chemicals and rubber tires and tiles on your roof and abstract things which didn't really have any nexus with the usual person in the street. Now you just take out your mobile phone and there are 5 or 6 antitrust cases on your phone alone. You have every citizen has access to these kinds of services. These are household names, unlike the makers of vitamins or hydrogen peroxide. It's come into our world. And also, I'd say not just the products, but also the power of the regulator. The more that we've seen companies get bigger, the more we've asked who are the policemen for these companies. And so someone like the European Commission or the Competition and Markets Authority in the UK might not have been a household name or not in my household a few decades ago, but now they are. People are turning to them and saying, what is it that you can do to help me?
Javier, what is your opinion? Is there anything else in addition to this changing the main topics and the main stakeholders?
I think it has to do also with the wider recognition or assimilation of these companies in people's daily life. I think COVID really brought to life the importance of these companies when we were all doing exactly what we're doing today. Yet another Zoom call. Glad to see that I'm not on mute for the first time in 3 years from the start. So that's good. But yes, I think that's really about just an understanding of the power of the technology to put us in touch with other people when we couldn't. And then we saw the role of these platforms, mainly, I think, Twitter and YouTube, on this information when we went from COVID to the war. So like on all fronts of regulation, we see the prominence or the shift or why we should care about, as Lewis said, who polices these companies.
Samuel, how do you see this paradigmatic, significant, or quintessential shift?
Yeah, well, I mean, largely in agreement with Javier and Lewis there. I mean, we're talking about large conglomerate firms that are publicly traded and indeed offer consumer-facing services. And these are technologies, these are platforms that have totally revolutionized how we live, work, and play, and they've come to represent hubs of innovation and enterprise, but that hasn't been without certain risks to fair competition. And there has been this tension that has emerged between global regulators and some of these gatekeeping digital platforms. And it's really about how we draw the limits of a rapidly developing digital economy, while at the same time preserving the principle of open business across free markets. And for me, it's this fundamental tension between the heights of those in public and corporate positions of power that makes these types of stories front page hitters. And I would imagine that these types of stories will continue to be on the front pages of the likes of the FT and MLex and Bloomberg for years to come.
Indeed, and obviously you represent these 3 media outlets which are trendsetters themselves, but you are also trendsetters within this media. So I wonder, what precisely do the editors of your outlets want from you? How do they want to simplify maybe, or which aspects appear to be more important? Javier, for them? How do you see this, the mechanics of the process?
For me, the sweet spot of when a story sells really well is when first you have tension, and secondly, you have big numbers. So, for instance, we had a record fine against Meta. It was more on the privacy side recently of 1.2 billion, and that went straight up to the front page of the FT, because you have this, as I said, these two elements: regulators or the police, the policemen, women in this case, fining or going after an enormous platform. It's like a David and Goliath sort of metaphor, if you will. So this is what really sells to my editors. In a way, it's slightly frustrating because, we're not in the business of really going deep in the way that we do when we have conversations with our sources in Brussels, and it can sometimes feel a bit frustrating because it's can oversimplify an issue, or like, when you have a record fine, even though the whole narrative among some of the regulators in Europe is that it's not really about the numbers of how much money you force a company to pay, but more about changing behavior. In the end, at a publication like the Financial Times, the numbers are the ones that get you right up on the front page.
Javier, and how is it in Bloomberg? Is it also about personalities and maybe some other elements which are less relevant for academic discussions or professional discussions, or it's mainly those main benchmarks which we all somehow consider as being important?
Well, I mean, for us, it's about the stories that have an impact on the market, right? But I do think that personality and character at large does play an important role in the coverage of antitrust investigations, because this policy field is really all about a regulator's own vision for how markets should be allowed to function in a free and democratic society, and a society indeed that vies to preserve fair competition. I think media coverage hones in on the personalities behind these decisions, because although we focus on singular cases involving very specific types of behavior, we're really talking about the parameters that are drawn for that free market, and we're talking about an individual's vision for a competitive economy. And those different visions can differ depending on which jurisdiction it is, depending on if a particular regulator takes an ideological approach. They can be very, very different. And I think that's the reason why personality plays such an important role in the coverage of these types of events.
Lewis, how would you explain to us the main KPIs for MLex?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, Javier and Sam? The big stories are going to be the big stories for anyone, no matter who you're working for. And we will all run around after them. We're lucky insofar as we're writing, nerdy legal stuff, that I can afford to look at things which don't have big numbers. In fact, sometimes don't have any numbers attached to them, but they have a really, really interesting legal question, which could have a bearing on some of these big cases. Two examples would be, for example, sports regulation. Sports regulation has taken place through predominantly through a case into two men in Lycra who go around an ice rink. The European Commission didn't take on Formula One, it didn't take on the Premier League, it didn't take on, boxing or these massive sports. It took on a small, pair of ice skaters in Dubai to establish a legal precedent, which then can be rolled out to Formula One or the Premier League. I can find space for that. Or in terms of digital tech, you can look at a case like Lithuanian Rail. It's 19 kilometers of railway that got destroyed in Lithuania with a fine, which is barely the size of a Christmas bonus of a gaffer exec, and it established an approach, or refreshed an approach to a legal question about people who run infrastructure, which is also what Facebook does, also what Amazon does, also what Google does. They run infrastructure. And so there is a line between a case about 19 kilometers of railway in Lithuania and Google and Facebook and Amazon. And that's the place where, MLex and we can find, a new angle which isn't getting picked up elsewhere.
Indeed. Okay, so we have identified that the hot topics are most important, and you are obviously the kind of the medium which communicate these big leaks, largest controversies which become public, and you obviously know, I imagine, this more the things that you are allowed or you expected to report, and you know them earlier. Samuel, you just recently communicated just yesterday about a new significant decision. So how this mechanics works in real life?
Well, I'm very sorry to disappoint you, Olesh, but obviously it's, as we get told too often enough, the whole thing's a very confidential procedure, and it would perhaps not be very smart of me to divulge too much on what goes on behind the scenes in terms of getting scoops and exclusives. But indeed, it's a process that, I mean, we all compete with one another, MLex, the FT, Bloomberg, we're chasing these scoops all the time. So it's a proactive beat in so much as it's not the type of policy field where you can sit back and expect people to come to you necessarily. You have to be knocking down doors, you have to be making phone calls left, right, and center, and really pushing sources as much as you can do in order to get those scoops and exclusives. But it wouldn't be a smart move of me to perhaps go into the specificities of how stories emerge for want indeed of protecting those confidential sources.
But we don't worry that much because we have Lewis and Javier who will tell us another side of the story, or an additional puzzle jigsaw in this constellation.
Yeah, well, when this video goes viral on YouTube, I just hope that those sources are duly protected and aren't exposed too much.
By viral, I mean from 100 to 250 views.
My tip is I just go around the back of Javier's flat, and anything which he threw out and didn't make it onto the FT, then I just go through his dustbin and stick it on MLex.
Because of
special devices for this, or just your ears?
Because of course, as Sam was saying, that we have to knock doors and call people, but as everyone knows, with the FT, I just sit in my flat and wait for the phone to ring. Really, ideally not on a Friday afternoon, and maybe not on a Monday morning, and that's it.
But they're not queuing. They're not queuing, at least.
There's a big queue. I have to turn people down all the time. No, on a serious note, yes, there might be some mystique around the process, but on a very basic level, really, it's about just building relationships with people, and it takes time, effort, dedication, and sometimes you have someone who is rather unwilling to share information with you, and you just keep going back and again and again and again. You really have to have a thick skin and just keep at it. Yes, don't give up, because I think that then it's a formula for disaster. Also, another really enticing aspect of this, I guess, is that we have competition. So I often think most jobs, you're only judged on the basis of what you do, there on the spot, whereas in our jobs, we're also judged by, the stories that I missed because Sam scooped me annoyingly yesterday, or, what MLex had, or what, we're not only sort of judged by the mere isolated fruits of our work, but also from others. So this really generates, quite a lot of competition amongst ourselves, which I think is quite good. Annoyingly, the myth of the FT just waiting for the phone to ring is not always true.
There's a broader point just on the back of Sam's, which is that this sector, more than or as much as any that I've known, is absolutely dominated by confidentiality. These are legal procedures which in some countries you can face prosecution for. If you're talking about, these are lawyers who and regulators and judges who have high ethical standards and are not allowed to speak.
And therefore, to add to that, you really must nurture and treasure your relationships and really make people absolutely confident that whatever conversation you are having with them, it's in the most sort of the highest sort of confidentiality and trust possible, because sometimes people do put themselves in some sort of reputational or even legal risks. So, one has to appreciate it. There's also, that's one part, but there's also obviously some intentional leaks that, come from sources that want some information out. I often wonder when people are speaking to me whether, and I'm pretty sure I don't know, but I'm sure that they have the blessing of someone higher up that I don't even know, I'm not even aware of. So it's quite a complex thing. One other thing, this is a subject that fascinates me, which is the building sources and gathering information. It's just to have really high emotional intelligence and just manage each relationship on its own merits, obviously thinking about the ethical standards of your publication, but at the same time, considering what kind of individual this person is, how they want to communicate, when they want to communicate. I'm obsessed, like this person do they like to communicate on WhatsApp, or like, are they a morning person, or do they, all these little things matter when getting in touch with this people, just to remove the myths about it. It's ultimately about building just basic, solid human relationships, I think.
Samuel, before we move to more digital stuff, do you want to add on this? Because I think you...
Only to say really that, just to echo what Javier and Lewis have both said in terms of the importance of trust in Brussels. There's only a handful of us on the competition and antitrust beat in this city, and it's a very small community as well, those living and working in the European quarter. And if a journalist were to ever, even in one case, abuse trust that has been afforded to them by a potential source or a source, then that can really damage a journalist's reputation for the long term. So the currency of trust is perhaps the most valuable in this city in terms of the craft of the journalist here. And it is so important to manage and massage that constantly and consistently. Again, not wanting to go into too much detail, but you have got to maintain these relationships for the long term. And these are relationships that, they may not bear fruits immediately in terms of the stories you're able to get out there. But one day there's that, even if there's that small chance that they could engender a potentially exclusive story for your publication, then that's a relationship that should be cultivated consistently throughout the course of your time working as a journalist here.
Let us move to digital. And when we talk about the digital sphere, we understand that there are several issues which are probably very delicate in their nature, but maybe you could reflect, maybe we will start with Lewis in this round, or on some aspects. For example, the latest development with Microsoft Activision Blizzard merger, different decisions by different authorities in the UK, in the EU, and also in other jurisdictions, of course. Did you observe some irregularities which are, which go beyond the confidentiality issues which you can expose to us?
Well, look, I think if you went to any competition law conference 10 years ago, all you'd hear time and time again was, we're working closely with our, fellow regulators around the world, and we are striving for convergence and business and legal certainty, and so forth. Nowadays, I think that's just been flipped on its head massively, both internationally, where you have regulators taking vastly different positions. You look no further than the UK, the US, Germany, and Brussels for differing approaches to very, very similar kinds of problems in some of the biggest tech cases, mergers, antitrust that you'll know. I think you've got a time of pretty fractious relationships. They'll all smile and they'll all shake hands and they'll all say we're all working together, but just look at the outcomes and the friction along the way. So I think that's so much for sort of international convergence. And then I think you've also got actually sort of friction between legal tools. You've got these new legal instruments coming about, be they DMA, be they reinvigorated Article 102 and so forth, is that actually within a jurisdiction, you've got frictions. You've got people struggling to work out who's in charge and what the right solution is and how we get there, be it between Article 102, the DMA, and Germany's 19A, be it between GDPR and competition law when it comes to addressing the power of data. I mean, there are fractures sort of everywhere you look with digital competition, which makes it so fascinating, but which means that you now go to a competition law conference 10 years later and you don't hear sort of really anyone striving for convergence. They're just striving for as little divergence as they can get. They all think actually they've got, they're all defending their way of seeing the world, be it a UK regulator, which has got a hard line on mergers, be it a German regulator, which has got a harder line on privacy abuses, be it the Irish, privacy commission, which thinks it's got the right way, it's got the right approach to GDPR abuses and doesn't want to be told what to do by anyone else. Everywhere you look, people are sort of defending their own interests in regulatory terms. And I think that's something which I think makes this quite a fractious environment at the moment.
That's a very, very, very elegant introduction to the main task which we designate to Javier, to explain to us, maybe to unravel a little bit more about the stakes, maybe, and the reasons. Or obviously we all speak in our private individual capacity.
To me, I think, from an FT perspective, it's very clear that the question is, can I do a merger or not? Will this get blocked or not? If I do a gaming deal with Microsoft Activision, do I even try? Because now we have this new voice in the UK. Actually, one of the only very few policies in which the UK has taken back control. Or gain even more powers to do things that it couldn't do in the past. And it's a big question mark because, with Microsoft and Activision, it's not like a factory deal where you can just shut down your plants in the UK and maybe just do the deal anyway. I don't think in the way the deal is structured that's feasible. So that really represents big headaches for businesses. So what does it mean for M&A in the future? Will companies be more risk adverse? Will we see less M&A? We're already seeing a sort of a deficit in the number of M&A transactions. Certainly what I see here in Brussels compared to 3.5 years ago when I started, there's hardly any deals that are worth our attention. I know there's a few phase 2 investigations, but I mean of the size and in the numbers that we saw or that I was writing about 3.5 years ago. So the reasons, I think one very basic one is that regulators feel that they were too permissive in the past. Facebook buying WhatsApp, Instagram, Google buying Fitbit, essentially, these so-called killer acquisitions or buy your rivals out of the way because you can't innovate internally. And now we are seeing the opposite, maybe an over emphasis in regulations. You see probes here in the EU that go to a lengthy phase of antitrust scrutiny only to be cleared in the end. So just sometimes I get the sensation, or people get the feeling that there is a need for regulators to show, particularly when it comes to digital mergers or mergers of where there is a data aspect to it, to really show that you've scrutinized it even more than in the past to sort of almost overcompensate for mistakes that were made in the past.
Samuel, and how do you see this? And maybe you can also explain your intuition when we observed the discussions on the DMA a few years ago and compare them with the discussion on the UK Digital Markets Competition and Consumers Bill. It looks like unprecedented asymmetry that people barely remember that the bill is still in the third reading, and it's equally interesting from juristic point of view, at least, as the DMA. We don't hear these conversations. Do you also connect these issues with maybe fatigue of the kind of different trajectories, or it's something more trivial?
Well, let's take this question in two parts. Perhaps I can start with the focus on mergers and Microsoft Activision, and then come to the regulatory aspect after. The stakes are high in Microsoft Activision, fundamentally because this is Microsoft's largest ever acquisition, and also the largest ever acquisition in the gaming industry. Now, the focus on cloud gaming in both the UK and the EU is hugely important because it's indicative of the prospect of a major and hugely profitable market emerging in the future, but one in which, if regulators don't act now, there could be potential abuses of dominance in the future there. But in this regard, the difference between the EU and the UK and their decisions on the Microsoft Activision merger centers around different interpretations on the development of this cloud gaming market. And so the CMA saw cloud gaming as a rapidly developing service in which large players and organizations are likely to emerge in the short term. Conversely, the European Commission said that the market was in a very, very early stage of its existence, and it was almost in somewhat of an embryonic stage. There wouldn't be any immediate risks to competition with this transaction being closed. And of course, you have ongoing litigation from the FTC against this deal in the United States. And this indeed will be a fascinating merger to watch, because it will be indicative of the direction of travel for merger enforcement in the United Kingdom, and it could spell uncertainty for the willingness of other large digital platforms to embark on those headline-hitting mergers. And I think it's that uncertainty that creates a bit of somewhat instability in the long-term business strategies of larger technology platforms who are still interested in mergers and acquisitions as part of their business plans for the future. Now, alongside that, of course, as you said, Olesh, we have this sort of regulatory convergence between the UK and the EU, insofar as there now seems to be a quite clear political consensus that we need some sort of an ex-ante approach to regulating digital markets. And I'm sure all of those who are tuning into this YouTube video will be well aware that the Digital Markets Act's prohibitions and obligations will begin to be enforced in early 2024. And the stage we're at now is very much in the early implementation / enforcement stages, leading up to the finalization of designations later this year. The UK approach is somewhat different. You're looking at similar players, but many have commented that the UK approach allows for more proportionality, allows for more flexibility. Some people have criticised the EU's approach for being a bit too prescriptive, whereas the UK's approach, it obviously isn't on the books yet, but it really does look into the specificities of certain gatekeeper behaviour, and it attempts to draw the limits against those specific players by use of a code of conduct. Yes, I think clearly there are, largely due to the rapid development of digital services, there has been an unregulated environment for a lot of these large technology services and platforms to develop in and to create new and innovative services, but services that have potentially, whether directly or indirectly, led to risks of distortions to several digital markets. Now, at least in the EU, there is that ex-ante regulatory framework on the books, and there will be severe guards on those types of behaviours. I mean, the DMA, as we all know, is based on years and years of antitrust enforcement in the digital economy. Those types of behaviours will no longer be permissible. But that isn't to say that the DMA is a panacea. There will be revolutionary innovations across digital services in the future that are highly likely to escape designation under the DMA. What happens then? Of course, the DMA can be updated, but there are forms of abuse that many regulators perhaps are not even aware of yet, but will be coming down the line in a few years' time. And I think a global convergence around a digital regulatory rulebook is actually positive for some of these gatekeeping platforms, because at least it gives them the clarity that they haven't had over recent years, and which has indirectly led to the levelling of these antitrust charges in the EU and elsewhere.
Indeed, and actually the DMCC has much more flexible toolkit for designation, and I think it will be much easier to designate or to establish new core platform services or digital activities as they use it in the UK. Before moving to the DMA and the relationship with gatekeepers, or how gatekeepers communicate to each other, Javier and Lewis, I wanted to ask your opinion. What in your view the reason why the DMA is so disproportionately more present in the media, or was 2 years ago, last year, than the DMCC these days? Javier.
I guess maybe if you look at it, I'm not entirely sure if I have the answers, but one, I'm just speculating. One is like the DMA covers a bigger geographical area. I think also, but I'm not entirely sure, it came before in the chronology of things. And so it has a first mover advantage in relation to the UK, not in relation to Germany, where we have this Section 19A, which has been in place roughly 18 months, a couple of years before the DMA. But I think from a news perspective, as you pointed out, this was a couple of years ago. Now, from my perspective, the DMA and its coverage has sort of died down because we're in this waiting period before the EU designates who is a gatekeeper. And I think no one will be shocked about it. Maybe the platforms themselves will be shocked about it, because we know already that Amazon has contested in Germany this notion that it's a company of paramount importance, because they allege that they compete with a huge, enormous market of similar rivals. And I guess that just gives us an indication of where things might be heading. I think we will see just a lot of litigation around the DMA, which then will spike again the interest around this piece of legislation. What I'm not entirely sure about, and I'm definitely not a legal expert or a tech expert, but I just see that technology moves so fast. Overnight, ChatGPT became like the thing and dominated the whole narrative. Is arguably the biggest non-crisis subject at the moment, and it happened very, very, very quickly. By the time that we have the DMA in place, by the time that all this litigation has gone through, by the time that it really starts biting, maybe Google will not even be around. We'll be ChatGPTing everything left, right, and center. And so it might not be that relevant. What the EU might say in its defense, that it's future-proof and it will capture future behavior somehow, and that it can also be updated. But I just think that then what we're describing is a highly convoluted, slow giant trying to, put the finger in something that is very nimble and moves very fast. So what are we doing, and what is the point of all this regulation is what I often wonder.
Let us revert to the DMA mechanic in a second. I wanted to ask Lewis his views on the discrepancy between the DMA and DMCC.
Yeah, like I think as Javier said, the UK approach, they were simply, didn't have first mover advantage. They did at one point. They had the Furman report, which was setting the tone for the questions and some of the ideas about how to answer them. But then it was stuck in splendid isolation as the UK government worked out, which way was up. I think Brexit clearly has diminished the regulatory importance of the UK approach. They're the third person to the party. There's another conversation. There's a conversation been going on between Brussels and Bonn for years, and now London's turned up. So I think it suffered just the dynamic of the debate. I think secondly, we shouldn't forget that what the European Commission's done, what the EU now has done in passing legislation, it is a first. It is a kind of legislation that didn't exist before. A competition-inspired single market regulation. That's why there's all this debate about the legal basis, because no one quite knows what it is. And it is a attempt to dream up a new way of thinking of things. The German approach is new as well, but it's still based on an amendment to existing competition law. It's not drafting, it's not taking a blank piece of paper and starting from scratch, which is what the DMA did. And on top of that, Brussels always has this sort of advantage of the Brussels effect. It's what they did with the GDPR. It's what they'll get with the DMA, which is this sort of advertising push, this thought leadership, whether it's warranted or not is a separate question, but you'll get then Australians, Japanese, Koreans, Indians, and so forth, all these people having their own attempts colored by the Brussels approach, or indeed, cut and paste in some instances. So I think just it's the nature of global regulation that the answer that Brussels comes up with always takes up more oxygen than the others.
In addition to this, I think another difference was that the proposal of the DMA has been published, even if during the Christmas time. We still have had an opportunity to comment upon this. With the DMCC, we didn't. Now it's kind of vacation season. It's already in the third reading. We discussed the modalities or some vague concepts, but never legal texts.
And everyone's been waiting for it. And there's vague concepts. There's an esoteric debate that you can have about some sort of, the platonic ideal of a core platform service. But in the meantime, the European Commission's proposal was already, halfway down the Parliament track and was being adopted and amended and so forth. While in the meantime, the debate was not quite as it might have been ripe intellectually, but it wasn't in legislative terms as ripe.
Let us move to the DMA itself, to the kitchen, so to say. Obviously, we understand that different gatekeepers will have been impacted differently by the DMA. However, general the obligations are, the implications will be different. Javier, let us start with looking at maybe your observations. Do they invoke different strategies? How do they treat, or if you look retrospectively over the last 2 years, can you identify different conducts or different protocols which are being played by different, without necessarily naming them, but is there a kind of whole spectrum of different approaches?
Do you mean by the gatekeepers or by the companies that are going to be designated?
Yeah.
I think that if we knew that, I would have written the stories already, but it's really hard to know now what they are up to. I mean, it feels like this black hole of people just complying with, I think they have to do issue a report to see how they're complying. And there's a specific deadline, which my colleagues will know. I forget what the date is. It's sometime after the summer. So it's really hard to gauge what the actual strategy is. But what I can tell you is that I would bet 10 euros that one of these big companies is definitely going to go after either the law itself in its essence, or launch proceedings like legal action against the Commission because of the way they are, one of their core platform services is being designated, because there will be a discrepancy in the way that this company, whichever it is, I have no idea, thinks that they are captured or not, and what the commission thinks. At the moment, you ask people and they're like, everything is good, everything is fine. But I think once we get to crunch time, I think things will be different. But which company, when, how, I don't know.
Samuel, how do you see this?
I suppose this question is really about the future efficacy of the DMA and how we judge its success, really. My personal view is that the European Commission sees unlocking innovation as a key mark of success of the future enforcement of this tool. Ideally, for them, it would be a form of innovation emanating principally from a broader scope of companies other than the traditional gatekeepers. And in this respect, of course, it's all about vertical fairness being a key principle of the DMA, despite the concept of fairness being a relatively nebulous one and a term over which economists the world over have had strong disagreements about. But I think it's really about that unlocking innovation for a broader scope of companies in which the DMA will be judged as having the most success on.
As regards how different gatekeepers are going about DMA compliance, I think initially the point that needs to be made is that the DMA is not as existential for every gatekeeper. Okay, there are some for whom there is a particular article for whom it can mean the end of their business model. I'm exaggerating, but it's a deeply existential single article, single prohibition, whereas for others, it's spread out more. There's 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 that might catch them. Some of them might be business opportunities for them, not just regulatory burdens. So I think, they mean different things to different gatekeepers. Secondly, you've got different gatekeepers at different parts of the regulatory cycle. Some who've had a lot of bruising battles behind them, some of who naturally have a different atmosphere inside the office about dealing with regulators, and those who are just entering some battles for the first time, who are still sort of up for the fight and are still fresh. Others are a bit more dazed and dreary and just want to get back to doing business. So there are different ways of cutting it. If you were to just take Amazon, which managed to take a antitrust case, settle it early, and basically create a roadmap for their DMA compliance, which I think was a smart move, looked on with great envy by others. You would put them down in the lover category, not a fighter. But then you look at what they're doing in Germany, where they're appealing the 19A designation, essentially. So they've gone to court there, whereas they didn't go to court in Europe. So just in one company, you're seeing different strategies. They have very good reasons for all that, but it's difficult to generalize. A lot of them have different bits of litigation around either with the DOJ or the FTC or with class actions in the UK, in Australia, and elsewhere. I mean, they're facing highly complicated regulatory territory, and they're all trying to chart a very different course. So I think when you look at someone like Google, they've got a really wide part of their business which is potentially affected by this. Whereas you look at someone like Apple, and the side loading issue about their app store is so important to them, and so you're naturally going to have different approaches.
Did you observe this trend over the last 2 or maybe 3 or maybe longer time, that some companies were more critical, others were more kind of obedient, saying, okay, let's play this game, it's tough, but at least make the rules clear, and maybe some others were more populistic, invoking some third parties a toolkit, kind of gray zone territory?
Well, I mean, in terms of lobbying, there's nothing wrong with lobbying per se. Of course, there are clear red lines and illegalities, but I actually think the most intense lobbying is still to emerge, potentially, when we do see litigation leveled against the Digital Markets Act or against specific parts of the Digital Markets Act. I think challenging the legal basis is quite an overly ambitious task. As you know, it's based on 114 of the treaty, which is about the harmonization of the internal market. And some have observed that there could be various conflicts and collisions between other efforts to clamp down on big tech giants using competition-like instruments, for example, as we spoke about earlier, Section 19A in Germany. I think trying to challenge the legal basis will be an overly ambitious task. I do think where we're going to start to see some of the more perhaps vehement challenges is when we talk about those core platform services yet to be designated. And just to go back to those key dates, so you have July the 3rd, which is the deadline for prospective gatekeepers to notify the Commission that their services are within the law's purview. And then you have a somewhat elongated period of time before the Commission will be required to verify those designations. I think it's early September the 6th or something like that. And then the prohibitions and obligations will become enforceable on March the 6th. But between that time, between September and March, I think is the time where we're going to hear a number of creative arguments being levelled. We're going to hear about a number of disagreements between the gatekeepers and the Commission themselves in terms of which services should be designated as CPSs and which shouldn't be designated. Largely speaking, it's far too early to make a pitch for which gatekeepers are really going to go after the DMA and try and be the least perhaps eager to comply with it at large. But rest assured that I'm sure behind the scenes, lawyers working for some of these gatekeepers will be maniacally drawing up strategies for pushing the law to its limit.
As regards lobbying on the DMA, look, lobbying is at its best when it's in the legislative arena, because there's lots of people to influence and there's amendments to be made and so forth. Now it's going to enter the judicial arena when it gets appealed, and there sort of lobbying or influence peddling takes on a slightly different color, because it's a couple of judges who decide a case, and influencing judges is quite difficult, or they're difficult to influence. I think you'll get some framing around the public perception of their appeals. If they are going to challenge the law in its different ways, it might appear that a company, although companies are not being should we say, not reading the room and understanding that actually these are different times for big companies, and big companies need to be regulated, and they should be regulated, and it's what the world wants. And if you're challenging that, you're kind of banging your head against the wall. I think a company would probably say, no, we are seeking legal clarity on a brand new piece of legislation that's untested, that we've never seen the like of before, and I think it would benefit from legal scrutiny so that we all know where we stand for the future, rather than you're denying a simple basic truth that you're a monopoly gatekeeper. So I think there will be different ways that people frame their legal challenges to make it look as though they're not sort of denying the bleeding obvious, but at the same time trying to just seek clarity, because this is going to be the rules of the road for the next decade or two.
The point about lobbying, yes, I think it will continue. It will be predominantly based around those legal challenges, any litigation that is raised, and there will be conflicts and disagreements between the regulators and some of these gatekeeping platforms. But it's all to come, and it keeps us all in a job, so we're not complaining.
For academics, really there is a big difference between how journalists think and how academics think. Academics go deep, journalists really don't go that deep, and we think about how we can sell this and make it more compelling. I think if an academic starts thinking more like that, even if you might think that it's sort of diminishing your work, there is a way where you can find a balance between thinking on the headline and also the substance. The more you get towards that part of the equation, the higher the chances that you will get noticed. Also build basic human relationships, as we said, right? If you're an academic and you want your work to be done, instead of sending me or any other journalist 250 pages with annotations and footnotes that go until eternity, just have a conversation and build a relationship with people.
Do you approach them or do they approach you?
I think it's a two-way street.
As regards academics, look, I think this area is so full of established voices and established entities, companies, pressure groups, trade associations, law firms, that often, even when there's a new thing that comes about, we often hear from the same people. And that could, so, you know, AI, it's remarkable how many times now on AI, it's the same people appearing, or on ad tech, it's the same people appearing, where it just can't be the case that these people, I mean, they're brilliant, but they've learned about AI in a weekend. You know, I'm being facetious, but there is so much, because the law is entering so many new spaces, as the AI debate has shown, there is a desperate need to understand this area, and that goes for AI. It goes for sustainability. It goes for, you know, the circular economy. It goes for raw materials. It goes for, I mean, batteries. Who knows about how the battery in a new car is made? And I just think there's a massive ability, massive moment for specialists in these areas to have their voices heard.
Far be it from me to advise academics how to go about their job, but I mean, in terms of speaking and engaging with journalists, we do indeed have a comprehensive list of academics working in this field, but the list can never be full enough. So reach out to us. We can grab an informal coffee if you're based in Brussels or elsewhere. Yeah, I mean, if you're looking to insert your name into this debate, there's always ample opportunity, and we're going to be covering these stories for years to come. So don't hesitate to reach out. We're not scary. We try and respond to as many emails as we can, and we're more than willing to hear from a plurality of voices.
Don't get into journalism because there's too many of us, and you're putting too much supply, you know, in the market. No, but anyway, just follow your passion and do what you want.
I concur with Javier in saying never become a journalist. Absolutely, I echo his remarks there. But on a serious note, to any young journalists out there looking to get into this patch, speak to people, network and approach people whose work you admire. Ask those people questions. Don't be afraid to ask questions that may appear relatively elementary to you. As journalists, we're always learning new information ourselves, and we're well versed in asking questions which often center on a subject that we may not necessarily know much about ourselves. So we very much know how any timid students would feel in that regard. My fundamental piece of advice would really be for students to have the courage to cultivate an insatiably inquisitive mind. And that will no doubt inform their craft in the future of journalism, how they are able to creatively source stories, and how they're able to get the stories which really, really have a big impact in Europe and globally.
Students, people thinking about journalism, and students in general, actually, embrace the ignorance. The best thing is not being expected to know, because it means you can ask, there's no expectation, you can ask the basic questions. Embrace it as a journalist, we're not expected to know. It's one of the best things out there is just being able to ask really, really simple questions. And it's remarkable how scared people are of asking simple questions. If you are going to, you know, in journalism, if you do get into what we do, one of the best things is actually to try to understand the law, understand the underlying law, because that makes it easier for you to ask the right questions. If you know that the underlying law specifies that there's a 20-day deadline, then you know that on day 19 you should be asking about this thing. So understanding the underlying law helps, because that's where the fights will be, and that gives you your timelines.
Javier Espinoza, Stolton, Lewis Crofts, thank you very much for sharing your brilliant ideas with us.